Let me tell you four strange stories from history. Stories that sound almost impossible, but really happened. So settle in by the fire, and let's begin. London, England, 1814. On the morning of October 17th, workers at the Horseshoe Brewery on Tottenham Court Road were going about their normal business. Inside the brewery stood an enormous wooden vat filled with porter, a dark beer that was extremely popular in London. The vat was enormous. It held more than 135,000 imperial gallons of beer. That is more than 600,000 liters. And that afternoon, something went terribly wrong. One of the metal hoops holding the giant wooden vat together suddenly broke loose. The pressure inside the container caused the vat to burst, and when it did, the force was enormous. A huge quantity of beer crashed through the brewery. Other containers were damaged, releasing even more beer. Within moments, more than 500,000 liters of porter were rushing into the surrounding neighborhood. The beer surged through the narrow streets of St. Giles. Walls collapsed, buildings were damaged, and people living nearby had almost no warning. The flood was especially dangerous because the neighborhood was densely packed with houses, many of them small and poorly constructed. Several buildings were overwhelmed by the sudden rush of liquid. 8 people died. 7 of the victims were women and children attending a wake in the cellar of a nearby home. Another victim was a young girl named Eleanor Cooper, who was working at the nearby Tavistock Arms pub. The beer eventually drained away, leaving behind wreckage, mud, and a neighborhood struggling to recover. But the story became even stranger when the brewery ended up in court. The company argued that the disaster had been an unavoidable accident rather than an act of negligence. The court agreed. The brewery was not held responsible for the deaths. The company itself had suffered enormous financial losses from the destruction of so much beer and equipment. The incident was eventually forgotten by much of London. That the Great Beer Flood remains one of the strangest industrial disasters in British history. There was no earthquake, no broken dam, no overflowing river. The disaster came from something far more ordinary, a brewery vat. And for a few terrifying minutes on an October afternoon in 1814, the streets of London were swept by a flood of beer. Northern Italy, 1325. Imagine 2 powerful medieval cities going to war. Thousands of soldiers take the field. A major battle is fought. And when the fighting is over, the victorious army takes home a trophy, a wooden bucket. This is the strange story behind the War of the Oaken Bucket. The 2 cities were Bologna and Modena, but the bucket itself was not really the reason they went to war. For generations, Bologna and Modena had been bitter rivals. They were also on opposite sides of the enormous political struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Bologna generally supported the Pope. Modena supported the Holy Roman Emperor. The rivalry involved political power, territory, and control of important fortresses. By 1325, tensions had reached a breaking point. Modenese forces captured the fortress of Monteviglio, an important position controlled by Bologna. The Bolognese responded by assembling a huge army. On November 15, 1325, the 2 forces met at the Battle of Zappolino. Bologna had a much larger army. According to later accounts, the Bolognese may have fielded tens of thousands of troops. Modena had far fewer. But numbers did not guarantee victory. The Modenese army launched a powerful attack and defeated the Bolognese forces. The Bolognese army was forced to retreat toward its city. The Modenese followed. And somewhere during this campaign, a wooden bucket entered the story. Modenese soldiers reportedly took a bucket from a public well in Bologna. It was not valuable. It was not a military weapon. It was simply a wooden bucket. But to the victorious Modenese, it became a trophy. They carried it back to Modena as a symbol of their victory over their longtime rival. Bologna demanded that the bucket be returned. Modena refused. The bucket remained in Modena, and eventually it became famous. Centuries later, the Italian poet Alessandro Tassoni turned the story into a mock-heroic poem called The Stolen Bucket. The poem transformed the bucket into the centerpiece of a humorous epic. The bucket was a trophy, not the true cause of the war. Yet the strange object became the symbol that survived. Today, Modena still remembers the story of the stolen bucket. A bucket associated with the legend is preserved in the city's historic collection. Think about that. The political struggles of medieval Italy have mostly faded from memory. The names of many soldiers are forgotten. The battles are distant. But a simple wooden bucket became the object people remembered. It is one of those moments when history seems almost too strange to be true. Serbia, 1732. In a remote village on the edge of the Habsburg Empire, people began dying. At first, the deaths were frightening but not unusual. Then the villagers began to believe something much more terrifying was happening. They believed the dead were returning from their graves as vampires. The events took place in the village of Medveja, in what was then the Habsburg military frontier. The story centered on a man named Arnold Paole, who had reportedly claimed during his lifetime that he had encountered a vampire. After Paole died, several people in the village reportedly became sick and died. The villagers believed Paole himself had returned from the grave and was responsible. Their fears became so serious that Austrian military authorities decided to investigate. A military surgeon named Johann Flukinger was sent to examine the situation. In 1732, he produced an official report called Visum et Repertum, meaning seen and discovered. The report described interviews with villagers and examinations of several corpses. What the investigators reportedly saw seemed to confirm the villagers' fears. Some bodies appeared unusually well preserved. One corpse was described as having fresh-looking skin and blood around the mouth. To modern medicine, these observations have ordinary explanations. After death, the body undergoes many changes. Skin can contract, gases can build up inside the body. Fluids can move and appear around the mouth and nose. To people who did not understand these natural processes, however, a corpse that appeared strangely preserved could look as though it had recently been alive. The villagers nevertheless believed they had found vampires. The suspected bodies were subjected to traditional anti-vampire rituals. Some were pierced with wooden stakes, others were burned. The Austrian officials recorded what they were told and what they observed. And this is what makes the story so remarkable. This wasn't simply a village legend passed down through generations. An official Austrian military report described the investigation. The report helped spread stories about vampires throughout Europe. Newspapers and writers began reporting alleged vampire cases from the Balkans. The idea of the vampire gradually moved from local folklore into European popular culture. This happened long before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. Of course, there is no reliable evidence that the people of Medveja were actually being attacked by the undead. Disease, fear, grief, and normal decomposition provide far more likely explanations. But in 1732, the people living in that village did not know that. They saw people dying. They saw strange-looking corpses, and they believed they knew the reason. The dead were coming back. Belgium, 1270s. Imagine a medieval conflict that lasted for years, devastated towns and villages, involved powerful nobles, and eventually required the intervention of the King of France. Now imagine that the story began with a stolen cow. The conflict became known as the War of the Cow. It took place in the region of Condraz in what is now Belgium. The trouble began with a peasant named Enguerrand, who reportedly stole a cow belonging to a man from Ciney. The animal was taken to a market at Anden, where the owner recognized it. Enguerrand was arrested. According to the traditional account, he was promised that he would be spared if the cow was returned. But after the animal was recovered, Enguerrand was executed. That changed everything. The killing became a dispute over jurisdiction. Enguerrand came from territory controlled by the Lord of Goznes, while Ciney was under the authority of the Prince Bishop of Liège. The Lord of Goznes considered the execution an attack on his rights. Retaliation followed, and what had begun as a dispute involving one stolen animal quickly became a conflict between powerful feudal rulers. Castles were attacked, villages were burned, troops were assembled. The Marquis of Nemours, Guy of Dampierre, became involved, along with other powerful nobles. The fighting spread throughout the region. Ciney became one of the major targets. The city was attacked, and medieval accounts describe terrible destruction, including people taking refuge inside a church that was then burned. The exact number of people killed is uncertain, and later claims of enormous casualty figures may be exaggerated. But the conflict itself was real, and it lasted for several years. Eventually, the fighting became serious enough that King Philip III of France intervened. By 1278, the conflict had been brought to an end. The strange thing about the War of the Cow is that the cow was never really the cause of the war. The deeper causes were feudal power, territorial rights, political rivalry, and competing claims of jurisdiction. The stolen animal was simply the spark, but that spark was enough to ignite years of violence. And that tells us something important about medieval Europe. Power was divided among countless lords, bishops, counts, and princes. A disagreement over one person's rights could quickly involve an entire chain of alliances and rivalries. Centuries later, people still remembered the conflict by its extraordinary name, the War of the Cow. One of Europe's strangest wars was not really fought over a cow, but without that cow, the war might never have begun.